안녕하세요. 코트라 워싱턴 무역관 심재환입니다. 1년 뒤 2024년 11월에는 미국 대통령 선거가 치러집니다. 선거 후 한미 관계와 글로벌 경제는 어떤 방향으로 흘러갈까요? 미국 정부와 의회는 한국의 역할과 중요성을 어떻게 평가하고 있는지, 그리고 대선은 한미 관계에 어떤 영향을 미칠지 헤리티지 재단 창립자이자 아시아 연구센터 회장을 맡고 계신 에드윈 플러 박사님과 이야기를 나눠보겠습니다. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Edwin Follner for making time out of your busy schedule for our Kotra Press interview. It is an honor to have you on our program. And welcome, Dr. Follner, to Kotra TV.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here. 감사합니다.
So first question is, from your point of view, how important is Korea to the United States? Can you explain to our Korean viewers how the U.S. sees Korea as a partner in U.S. interests?
Yes. The Korea-U.S. economic interest is more important today than it ever has been in the past, and it is more advanced than it ever has been in the past. So Korea has just grown to be a very significant partner, and that's coming clear in so many different ways. And it's coming clear in terms of just recently the joint meeting of Hanwha Ocean, Hyundai Heavy, SK, all the shipbuilding companies from Korea coming over, visiting with the U.S. Navy. I mean, these kinds of things would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. So we're hoping very much for that, and the U.S.-Korea relationship is stronger than it ever has been, and for that we are very grateful to both the current administration for everything they have done, but also in terms there of the Camp David Accord, the trilateral meetings, etc., but also to the Trump administration that renegotiated the KORUS U.S. FTA free trade agreement, and that is now kind of the bedrock of more and more economic cooperation.
Thank you, Dr. Follner. What perspective do the current White House and the U.S. Congress have on the Indo-Pacific economic framework?
The U.S. is very much, under both Republican and Democrat administrations, very much committed to enhanced U.S. economic relationships with all of Asia. I remember when the Heritage Foundation established its Asian Studies Center almost 40 years ago, my colleagues and I said, someday, U.S. trade with Asia will be as large as it is with Europe. Well, now it's 3 times as large with Asia as it is with Europe. So Asia is more important than ever. And that's significant because at the same time we're expanding trade, we're also looking more at friend-shoring, not just offshoring, but friend-shoring, about how we work more closely with Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with India. With Vietnam, for that matter. The U.S.-China relationship is, despite the recent summit between President Biden and President Xi in San Francisco, it's still one where there is bipartisan skepticism about the ability to have a good long-term economic relationship with China.
Thank you, Dr. Follner. With China siding with Russia and the Ukraine war, starting up a new economic trade Cold War, and China still being the largest trading partner of Indo-Pacific countries, how do you see restructuring of trade partners and trade allies in the context of IPEF, especially when China is aggressively moving in the region's economic and infrastructure plans as major investors, or in the form of a major trading partner?
The U.S.-China economic relationship is more and more not only coming under scrutiny, but it's also being examined very specifically. Here we had retirees from the U.S. military whose pension funds were being invested in companies that actually were designing and aligning themselves with the PLA against the United States of America. I think those days are over, and they're over, I think, very much on a bipartisan basis. Both Republicans and Democrats agree on this, both in the House and in the Senate. I think here of Hanwha, who has moved their whole solar panel business out of China into the state of Georgia here in the United States. I think of Samsung, who produces their cell phones now not in China, but in Vietnam. And there are new attempts and new efforts across the board and to move out of China and move elsewhere. And I think that's very important, but we're moving again to work more closely with our friends and particularly with the ROK.
Thank you. What strategic and economic role do you see Korea play in all of this?
I would say they will play a vital and enlarging role. The Korean opportunities, both strategically within the Pacific and also worldwide. Here I think about the tragic, awful Russian invasion of Ukraine and what this did to wake up America's NATO allies that, hey, there still is a major threat to the free societies around the world. And it's not just China in Asia, it's elsewhere around the world too. And so now you have kind of all of Central Europe saying, hey, we better upgrade our military capabilities since we're on the cutting edge and we're on the border of Russia. Where are they looking? Well, they can look to the United States, but unfortunately, the United States military-industrial complex has shrunk, and we've been sending a lot of our capabilities to Ukraine in the short term. So where do they look next? They look to Korea because of what Hanwha, what Hyundai Heavy, and so many other critical companies are doing in terms of exports to the whole of Eastern and Central Europe to upgrade their capabilities to meet the challenge of Russia. And this is the kind of new opportunities that Koreans have been very adept at adopting to. President Yoon, as having attended several of the NATO summits in Europe, has become, as President Biden and Secretary Blinken have said, a non-NATO strategic partner. And I think that's very, very significant that Korea is now looking around the world, not just looking to Asia Pacific, but also around the world in terms of these kinds of opportunities. And for that, I commend my friends in Korea for having that kind of forward insight and movement ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Foner. In recent years, members of Congress have expressed interest in U.S.-Korea cooperation over North Korea policy, the U.S. military presence in South Korea, and bilateral trade and investment flows. But not all members of Congress agreed on the IPEF initiative put forth by this administration. What is your analysis and thoughts on IPEF's progress, especially Pillar 1 trade, and what significance is it regionally and globally?
Yeah. The internal machinations of the U.S. Congress, particularly with regard to the U.S. administration, is always a changing set of variables. When I go out and talk to specific members of the House, of the Senate, in staff people inside the White House, the U.S.-ROK economic relationship is arguably stronger than it ever has been. Will the United States continue in terms of a multilateral relationship in Asia? We're having a lot of problems multilaterally recently, not only with China, not only with Russia, with Iran, and also with DPRK, with North Korea. I mean, you've got those four, as I believe it was former Senator Lieberman described them as the new axis of evil, really. And the four of them all cooperating, whether it's China buying cheap Russian oil, whether it's Iran supplying drones to Russian side for the Ukraine battles, and also now providing it to various terrorist groups in the Middle East where they're attacking U.S. facilities around the region. And sometimes I'm afraid that economics kind of plays second fiddle to the political and confrontational situation that the world faces. But I remain fundamentally an optimist too.
Thank you. Now, we would like to turn to our final question. Overall, the relationship between the United States and South Korea has been influenced by various factors, including politics, trade, and economic ties. The people of South Korea, particularly the commercial sector, is paying special attention to the U.S. elections over whether the election outcomes could affect some of the U.S. economic and industrial policies such as the IRA, CHIPS Act, and the IPAF. Can you talk to our viewers on what your expert opinion on the current situation and political influence on the current economic and trade trajectory, and what may change post-2024 election from the Republican majority point of view versus the Democratic majority point of view?
The political situation in the United States is going to be very challenging for the next year. I'm sure many of you have seen the last week's issue of The Economist, where they say that the biggest threat to the world in 2024 is Donald Trump. I think that's a gross exaggeration, and I'm sorry that some of my friends at The Economist would make a claim like that. To me, the biggest threat in 2024 remains that axis of evil cooperating in terms not only of strategic interests militarily, but also collaborating more intensely in terms of economic relationships, whether it's cheap oil to China or whether it's drones from Iran to Russia, or shells from North Korea to Russia to fight in Ukraine. But that's, in some respects, that's kind of a little bit almost second tier. The point I made earlier that I feel very strongly about is that Donald Trump, who is not, and I say this having known the man for some years, he's not always the most predictable person. But one thing that I know from talking with him and talking with Secretary Pompeo and other senior officials in his administration is that he is very proud of the fact that he renegotiated with the former Korean administration the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and that is something that he will stand by. Well, that means that the U.S. and Korea have a predictable level playing field if and when Trump is elected. And at the same time, what I would say, if Biden is elected, I think I would give Biden credit for what he did with AUKUS, bringing the UK back into the Pacific and strengthening the Australia relationship with the rest of the Pacific, and what he has done in terms of reinvigorating the trilateral relationship between U.S., Japan, ROK, both at Camp David and at the Washington Accords, and pulling it all together and saying we all have to work much more closely together. How can we do that? How can we make that happen? Not just with the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, U.S. Let's talk about bringing Korea into the Quad. Let's talk about how Korea, U.S., Korea, Japan, U.S. can be much more closely aligned with each other. So on the strategic questions, I'm very, very comfortable. And as I said already, on the economic questions, I think Biden's been a very good friend of the ROK. And clearly, Trump has got much to be proud of for what he did in the U.S. bilateral relationship economically with Korea. And so I'm fairly sanguine about how the bilateral relationship will proceed.
Yeah. So really, it's the final question. The U.S. presidential election is a significant event that can impact the global economy. Any comment on your prediction?
It's 11 and a half months away from the U.S. presidential election, and it's not as easy to actually make sensible predictions now as it was then. You all read the American media. You know what the pros and cons are of both of the candidates, and it's going to be a real horse race right down to the end. And as various people have said, it's going to come down to a handful of states and that will determine the difference, and particular groups of voters inside those states. How how do they cast their vote and what will be the deciding issue, whether it's the economy on one side, whether it's some social issues on the other side, whether it's foreign policy, international economic policy. Much of it comes back, though, always to the economy. And based on what the situation in the economy is now, yes, it's less bad than it was a year ago, but I remind any American voter, whether they live here in the United States or whether they happen to be living at the moment in the Republic of Korea, if you ask yourself, well, you're better off than you were 4 years ago, the answer today has to be no. When you look at interest rates, when you look at the rate of inflation, when you look at wages not keeping up with inflation. So I guess I'm cautiously positive that the Republican nominee, Trump or whoever, looks like it's going to be Trump right now, but who knows, will be the victor. But I hope we talk again before then. Maybe I'll have an update.
Okay. Again, thank you for your time, and I really appreciate your sincere and informative responses.